Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Islam, the Way of Life, with myself, Paul Salahuddin Armstrong. Today we are joined by Iqbal Nasim, who is the National Manager of the National Zakat Foundation. And we are going to discuss Zakat and Sadaqah within Islam. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, what is the importance of Zakat within Islam?
Okay, so as most people know, Zakat is the third pillar of Islam. So we have the 5 pillars: Shahada, Salah, the 5 times daily prayers, Zakah, fasting, and Hajj. And I think the best way to kind of understand the significance of Zakat in Islam is to look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Zakat in the Quran. So the word Zakat itself is mentioned 32 times in the Quran. And 28 out of those 32 times it is mentioned in conjunction with the Salah, with prayer. So for example, there are passages in the Quran where Allah might say, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ, establish prayer and give zakah, or He describes those who establish prayer and give zakah. So in the sense of kind of giving us an understanding of what are the key ingredients, if you like, of the absolute core ingredients of the life of a believer, then prayer and charity are so often repeated.
Yeah, of course, charity, because zakat is, for those who are not necessarily Muslims and not familiar with the meaning of zakat, zakat is alms giving within Islam, or the equivalent in Christianity would be tithing. It is paying into a community fund, which would then help those who are less advantaged within the community. So, how does this work in practice? How is this put in practice in the past, and how is it put in practice today?
Sure. So, the kind of formal rules and regulations around zakah were basically came in from the second year after the Hijri in the Muslim calendar. So approximately 15 years into the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How does it work in practice? Well, essentially, zakah is an annual calculation, if you like. It is paid once annually by an individual, and it is calculated and paid on an individual basis. So each individual, for example, even within a family, would look at their own wealth and ascertain and essentially make an estimate of their net worth, and then pay a specific percentage as zakah. The reason why I'm trying to keeping to a sort of vague description at the moment is because there are a lot of then specifics, as you know and you will understand, when you come to the various aspects of that. So there are certain types of wealth that qualify as zakatable. So for example, the cash that we have, livestock that we may own, for example, various types.
Not necessarily in the city areas.
No, not necessarily here. Not necessarily for most people here. But then in certain parts of the country and in certain parts of the world, that's a significant thing. And obviously, even traditionally, if you like, camels, back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, were the equivalent of, let's say, cars today. So certain types of wealth, certain crops, for example, for those who are involved in that, even at a kind of country level, if you like, treasures and minerals from underground. All of these might be things that are subject to zakah. Also, business stock, for example. So if any businessman, the cash within that business, the stock that they actually have for sale, those things are all potentially subject to zakah. I mean, one of the kind of the issues that the community faces, I suppose, is a kind of an easy to understand and accurate way of actually calculating their zakah, and especially when nowadays you have more complex, if you like, investments and more complex ways of people holding their wealth. So let's say, for example, someone owns shares, or they have a pension, or they have a specific type of savings product, that is available. Then there are kind of further considerations that then need to be taken in.
Increases the complexity of making this calculation.
Yeah, I mean, I think people then I think the layperson then is often confused about how exactly they should treat each of those assets or investments from a zakah perspective. And obviously there are certain types of wealth, so let's say gold and silver, for example, which obviously, again, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, gold and silver, dinars and dirhams were the form of currency, and there was no question about the fact that they were subject to zakah. But now, obviously, we transact in paper money, but the question still comes over the issues of gold and silver jewellery, for example, with some scholars saying that gold and silver jewellery that, for example, is habitually worn and is an item of personal use is subject to zakah, but others saying that no, gold and silver the jewelry that you wear won't be subject to zakah. But if you're hoarding gold and silver and you're just storing it, if you like, then it would be. So there are sort of some, if you like, well-established differences of opinion amongst Muslim scholars about certain categories of wealth as well.
I was thinking that when you mentioned gold and silver, because I've even come across scholars who insist that the zakat must be paid in gold and silver, which is rather awkward in this day and age. When
well, I think that's. I mean, I know of the view that you're talking about, and I think that whilst we can respect where they may be coming from, practically speaking, that's not it's not it wouldn't be practical. I think it obviously needs to be understood that ultimately, what are people transacting in? Well, they're transacting in paper money, pretty much, and so typically that's how your zakah is going to be paid.
Okay, so tell us more about. Do you have any systems in place which would make it easier to calculate the zakat then?
Yeah, I mean, so through the work that we do at the National Zakat Foundation, I mean, one of the elements of the work that we do is specifically focused around servicing zakat payers within the UK. So we actually have, for example, an online calculator that facilitates the process for somebody to actually calculate their zakah. I mean, there are a whole host of calculators online, but actually most of them leave more questions for the person doing the calculation than answers. And really, it is an area that we need to treat as seriously as somebody might, for example, deal with their taxes or deal with their legal affairs or deal with their financial affairs with an accountant. Just as somebody may need an accountant or a lawyer, or a tax advisor, well, actually, there is a place for somebody to advise properly around their zakah as well. So for somebody who's got very simple financial affairs, that shouldn't be too complicated. But for somebody who has more complex financial situations, and for example where there's certain debts and liabilities involved, and to look at all of that, then there is a space for that to be provided. So we're essentially, as a charity, we're providing that support and that service for zakat payers. And we have, for the last few years, we have essentially been telling people, and we've been receiving, calls and meeting requests to basically say, I'm confused about this, I don't know how to treat that, help me with this particular thing. So we do have things available on, through our website and through, various channels.
You do raise a very important and pertinent point, because at the end of the day, I mean, zakat is so vital to the well-being of the Muslim community, and it's the lifeblood of the community. I mean, the Beit al-Mal that is traditionally made from the zakat payments, this is what goes to help the poor people in the community.
Yep.
In traditional Muslim societies, this was it not sort of like the welfare system that we have today in the West? So if zakat is not paid, then there is no support coming from the Muslim community to help those in need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a huge, it's hugely important. And when you assess the importance of zakah, I mean, going back to your original question, you can look at that from many different angles. So first of all, there is the importance for the zakah payer. Okay, we believe that when someone pays zakah, that they are actually engaging, first of all, of course, in an act of worship and an act of obedience, as part of their, as part of the 5 pillars that we described. But we also believe that that has a kind of purifying impact. So zakah, the word zakah itself, has sort of linguistic meanings of purification and also of blessing and growth. So when somebody pays their zakah, we believe they're purifying themselves. We have the concept of obviously purifying our hearts from various things, and paying zakah purifies us from miserliness, from greed. We believe that it purifies the wealth itself, because even if somebody's earning their wealth in a lawful fashion, there may be elements of dishonesty that have crept in there. For example, there may be things where maybe that all of that wealth hasn't been earned to the extent that someone really deserves all of it that has come through. So there's an element of purifying the wealth itself, with the belief that then what is left over will have more barakah and more blessing, for that individual and for the ways in which they spend that money. But then obviously, as you mentioned, from a top-down, from a societal perspective, zakah, we always talk about zakah being the right of the poor. So the concept of zakah in Islam is that at any one time, a person holds a certain amount of wealth, but a portion of that is never actually theirs. That wealth is actually somebody else's, who is deserving, and we just view ourselves as temporary carriers of that trust, if you like, to then pass that on to an eligible recipient at the appropriate point in time. So we don't view zakah as our money in a way. We view that as the right of the poor, the right of the eligible recipient. And what we need to understand is that not fulfilling the rights of the poor and the destitute and those who are eligible to receive those funds, is a very, very serious matter. It's well known that the first caliph in Islam, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, that when people started to refuse to pay zakah, he actually went to the extent to say that he would, he would send sort of parties to go and forcibly retrieve those zakah funds. So in a modern context, one may look at that and say, this is a typical sort of, Muslim behaviour. We go and when we don't know how to do something, we go and do it by force and go and get it by force. But if you actually look at the reason as to why that was so important to him, he mentioned when questioned about it, and even his companion Umar radiallahu anh questioned him about that approach. Who's usually was a sterner kind of, sort of a companion, let's say, and he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam never distinguished between salah and zakah. And so the extent of its importance, that was one, but also because we know that Abu Bakr was so passionate about the fact that the rights of the poor should be protected. And so one person not paying their zakah, or just putting sort of not giving it its due importance, is one person or many people who are in difficulty or in poverty remaining in that situation. And when you view it from that perspective, then you can see that actually, yes, there is a whole lot of importance that needs to be given to actually making sure that whatever that total amount of money that should be being paid is actually being paid. And right now, although we don't know for sure, it's very difficult to get proper data on this, but we certainly feel that in the UK and probably globally, it's probably only a low percentage of the zakah that should be being paid is actually being paid.
That's a very good point. Of course, Abu Bakr, may Allah bless him, was famous for giving everything away. He went beyond zakah into sadaqah, and very, very generous man. Anyway, we'll return to this very interesting topic after the break. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the show. So, Iqbal, you were mentioning before about the importance of zakat and how we have to calculate this, and both how it can be understood from the perspective of the individual's responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the community, and also for the rights of the poor. It's interesting you mentioned Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, because his generosity was tremendous. I mean, he was famous for, even at one point, he had nothing to sell and he was thinking of selling the shirt on his back, and then his companions had to stop him and say, whoa, hang on, you're the caliph, you have certain rights too. But it's interesting when he had that spirit of giving. Do you find that spirit of giving is in many Muslims today?
No, absolutely. I think there's definitely a big spirit of giving, amongst the Muslim community. I mean, I can only talk mainly for the UK Muslim community. In fact, there was a recent survey by the Times newspaper here in the UK that said that the Muslim community in Britain is the most generous community of the faith communities.
I'm familiar with that.
In the UK.
That was interesting.
And they compared that to the various faith communities, as well as those who identify themselves as being atheist as well, and looked at that. So that was interesting. So we know, and I think we know from when we go to the mosque, especially in the month of Ramadan, going through the mosques and seeing various charitable appeals, and you see it on the TV and on the radio and kind of posters and billboards, and wherever you look now in the Muslim communities, there's a huge sort of a huge rush to give sort of charitably. So I don't think there's any doubt about the generosity of the community. And actually, the community in the UK is a relatively poor community. So that's not to say that there aren't successful, financially successful sort of Muslims here. I mean, I think they say sometimes that there are 5,000 to 10,000 Muslim millionaires in the UK as well. So there are obviously those to be accounted for. But on average, it is a relatively poor community. But definitely we find a relatively generous one.
And when the zakat is collected, how do you process this? And let's start with that. How do you process it?
Okay, so I mean, from our perspective, from a National Zakat Foundation perspective, as I mentioned, our remit is the UK. So what makes us unique is that we actually distribute all our zakah within the United Kingdom, whereas the vast majority of zakah that is collected in the United Kingdom typically has gone abroad. But one of the classical principles of zakah is for it to be locally distributed, and this is, I suppose, the sort of tradition that we're trying to bring back, in a way, for people to actually think about the fact that even though it may not always be visible, poverty, destitution, financial distress do exist within our community, and especially in recent times in the UK, that has been on the rise. So, for example, the charities that deal with operating food banks, for example, have seen a humongous rise in the last 2 years. I think the most recent sort of news story around this was that last year the charity that operates the most number of food banks in the UK served close to 1 million meals here in the UK to individuals who are, sort of, who obviously took, had to go there out of desperation. And they can have stories sometimes of people travelling for miles by foot because they can't afford the transport, to turn up at these places right here, in the UK to access that kind of, that food support with their food. So, the issues are real and the issues are here. And as I said, the Muslim community here on average is a relatively impoverished community. And there's absolutely no doubt that there are, in a community of 2.7 million Muslims, there is no doubt that there are thousands of Muslims in this country who are eligible to receive zakah. And so in terms of the way since we've been going since 2011, we've now dealt with over 1,300 cases of eligible sort of recipients. And we see all sorts. In the way that we administer our funds, there are essentially two streams of work. So one stream is essentially a tailored but thorough approach to an individual or family circumstances. That means we analyse and understand what their situation is, and then provide them essentially a hardship grant with the zakah funds to help them in the most, in what we deem to be the most effective and impactful way. And we do this in a way that recognises the other forms of support that are available within the country. So we don't we try not to spend any money that essentially could be sourced elsewhere. But where there is a gap, and there are increasing gaps between what the environment and the state can provide and what the reality of people's situations are, then we come in with zakah funds to fill that gap. And then we're also funding at the moment 4 supported housing projects around the country. So we have 3 housing projects for homeless Muslim women, and 1 which has just started for young Muslims who are leaving prison. So this again is a big issue. So there is a big issue of Muslim prisoners and ex-offenders within the UK, and a very high rate of reoffending as well. So whereas the Muslims are 5% of the national population, they are nearly 20% of the prison population. And a lot of them are in the statistic. Yeah, it is very concerning. And a lot of them are in that 16 to 21 age range. And a lot of them, when they leave, even if they have the best will in the world, and let's say they've been in prison for 6 months for a minor offence or whatever, and they develop the kind of the will to change, and they want to do better, and they don't want to go back to the life that they were living, and all the rest of it. Even if they do all of that, at the point of leaving prison, there's very little. There can be very little support available sometimes. So, let's assume that this person has come from a broken family, or now as a result of what they've done, they can't return to their family, for example. Well, they don't have a home to go to necessarily. They may not have any kind of really sort of good support network to go to. They will find it very hard to get a job with a criminal record, so they can't find a source of income and employment. And so usually the only thing that they, even if they do have the best will in the world, the only thing that they will end up doing is basically going back to what they were doing before, because by helping out in some drug deal, for example, they can earn a few £100 very, very quickly, and they can't find a way to do that anywhere else. So what we're trying to say is that we shouldn't see recipients or zakah recipients as people who deserve the situation that they find themselves in, which is often the psychology that people get into. Often when we pass by a homeless person, we don't think, how can we help this person? We think, oh, he's a drunk. Oh, he must have done something, to deserve this, situation, or he's, misspends his money or whatever it is.
It's a common way of thinking. So who actually is eligible to receive the funds raised through zakat collection?
Okay, so in the Quran there are 8 categories of zakat recipients actually mentioned. So the first is the fuqara, and the second is masakin. So this refers to the poor and the destitute, poor and the needy. The third, interestingly, is the amilin. So amilin actually refers to the zakat administrators. So those people who actually work in the zakat administration or are employed to actually operate the zakah fund are actually put in as a eligible recipient of zakah as well, which for a lot of people is kind of is surprising, because especially in the Muslim community, although we are the most generous community, we're also the least tolerant when it comes to any of our charity that goes to what we call administrative cost. Whereas obviously there's an understanding, and even the Quran there's an understanding that in order to run anything properly, there is going to be some cost. Just as to run a business or to run anything else, there is going to be cost involved to making sure that things are happening appropriately.
It's very interesting that this point is made early in Islamic teachings,
yep.
because it's very much something which is considered now. I mean, there's a lot of charities and people that are generous within the community who've done work, but then they haven't took anything for it. And of course, when that particular individual leaves the community or dies, then often we find that the work stops with them, because there isn't that kind of network of support. So in order to run things professionally, you do need to get people paid.
No, exactly.
I think this is,
and it's about building an institution.
Yeah.
That's the point. It's about building an institution. So, for example, with our work, we're very keen to build something that is sustainable and that can keep going and exist as a service that isn't dependent on me or anybody else, forever, but actually operates like an organisation and will pass, inshallah, through the generations. But going back to the recipients of zakah, so you have the poor, the needy, the administrators. Then you have a category which is وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُم, which is a very interesting category, which literally means those whose hearts are to be reconciled. Scholars have interpreted in different ways, and it's had a lot of discussion. But for example, it may refer to new Muslims, especially in our context. So, somebody who's coming to the religion, who often, as a result of doing so, may actually experience a lot of difficulty as a result of their perhaps loss of connection with their own family, their own traditional kind of support network that they had before. And a lot of them we find a lot of applications for support come in from people who have ended up without a source of income anymore and become homeless and all sorts because of that decision. And again, within the community, sometimes that support network isn't quite there. So again, it's an interesting kind of category that's been identified as new Muslims, or those who might be weak in their iman, or may need kind of essentially bringing back into the fold almost. That yes, we can use zakah funds to support them in ways that are appropriate for them to feel part of that community again. Yeah. And we have seen this actually, real life examples of this, where where we've had people who we have supported with their needs, who as a result of that have said, I actually feel Muslim again. I feel like I'm part of this community. Whereas the reality is, for many, many years in our context, our institutions, our mosques, our centres actually haven't been equipped to deal with people who are in difficulty. So when somebody in difficulty turns up to a mosque, for example, and they say, I'm hungry, I have nowhere to sleep, and if that mosque can't deal with their problem, which 9 times out of 10 they can't, then you're in a situation, well, what is that person going to feel then? They're going to feel, well, my community actually isn't there for me, which is a big problem. So we're trying to obviously reverse that trend. Then you have, traditionally there was a category of wafid riqab, which refers to freeing slaves. Now, obviously, in our current context, that doesn't really necessarily apply in that way, but that was a traditional category.
We hope it doesn't.
No. Well, in certain parts of the world, clearly slavery does exist. So if we can use money to do something about that, then I think that possibly can obviously come under that category. But obviously, within the UK, for the purposes of our work, we don't look at that. Wal gharimin means those who are in debt, and those who are in debt out of necessity. So somebody's incurred a debt, they were in a desperate circumstance, and now they don't have the funds to kind of repay that debt. Then the zakah can be used to repay the debt. And 2 more categories were fi sabilillah, which refers, in general terms, in the way of Allah, literally. Traditionally, this was understood that this would refer to kind of possible in a context where a just war or defence was being engaged in. That certain funds could go to supporting that effort if it was necessary. In the current context, many scholars talk about using zakah in this way for general sort of dawah purposes, for example. Although it's a hotly contested issue actually. But anyway, that's that one. And the last one was wabn as-sabil, which is a destitute traveller. So, for example, we've actually had a situation, for example, where somebody was from Trinidad, was coming back from Hajj and flying through London, and he was coming with his 2 parents. And when he was in London, or on the plane on the way, his parents became ill, basically. So when he was here, he was essentially obviously travelling to his country of origin, but he was kept here for a period of 4 to 6 weeks, because they were not allowing his parents to kind of get onto the flight, being in a state of illness. So in that interim period, as kind of travellers who are without the financial resources to look after themselves, we actually stepped in and kind of took care of their facilities and what have you.
I think you've given us a very good roundup there of who is eligible for zakah and the other points about zakah in the beginning. Thank you so much for taking part in the show.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having you in the next episode, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Until next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.